Hi everyone, my name is Hannah Cunningham. I am a graduate student in the Department of Resource Economics and Environmental Sociology at the University of Alberta.
Hi, I'm Robbie Potts. I'm an undergrad in the Faculty of Ales. My major is land reclamation, and I also work alongside Hannah and Dr. Brenda Parley.
So the title of our presentation is the development of a community-based monitoring program for chronic wasting disease in Maskwacis, Alberta. And this was done with myself and Robbie and my supervisor, Dr. Brenda Parley. The funding for this project has been provided by Genome Canada. So this is an ongoing project, and this presentation is based on a paper that is in development. So a bit of an outline of our presentation. We'll have the introduction and then review some of the conventional approaches to wildlife disease management, go over what chronic wasting disease is, and some of the gaps in monitoring for Indigenous communities. We will give a brief overview of the setting in which this project took place, which is Maskwacis, Alberta. We will address some of our guiding methods and theories that guided this project, and then we will get into the how-to of developing a community-based monitoring program for CWD, and then have some conclusions at the end. Community-based monitoring approaches to monitoring and natural resource management have increased in popularity in recent decades, particularly in research or management activities that include Indigenous communities. So community-based monitoring is really the involvement of local resource users and stakeholders, government agencies, and academics in the monitoring of natural resources. So while there are quite a few examples in Canada, and especially in Canada's north, of community-based monitoring programs that look at wildlife population changes, landscape changes, there are few community-based monitoring programs that focus specifically on wildlife health and disease management. Specifically, there's quite a large gap in the amount of Indigenous involvement in the monitoring of chronic wasting disease, a disease that has the potential to directly impact the food security and health of Indigenous communities in Alberta that rely on the subsistence harvesting of these animals. So a bit of a background on conventional wildlife health and wildlife disease management. These issues of wildlife health and wildlife disease often become a concern once they start to pose a threat to human health or domestic animals or the agriculture industry. So conventionally, wildlife health and wildlife disease management is rooted in Western science, with lots of focus in the areas of biological sciences, including microbiology, population ecology, and epidemiology. Wildlife disease management activities typically target or manipulate the disease agent itself, the host species, the habitat of the host species, or human activities that facilitate the spread of disease. So in recent years, starting around the early 2000s, the study and area of wildlife health and disease management may be moving more towards a integrated and interdisciplinary approach. So an example is this idea of One Health. And One Health is the interdisciplinary integration of human, animal, and environmental health due to the recognition that these areas are inherently linked together. And this really integrates the human dimensions of wildlife more than previous ways that wildlife health and wildlife disease were managed. So what is chronic wasting disease, or CWD? It is a 100% fatal, transmissible, spongiform encephalopathy type prion disease that affects deer, moose, elk, and caribou. Another type of TSE that you might be familiar with is bovine spongiform encephalopathy, also known as BSE or mad cow disease. And this disease spreads through it being shed into the environment through animal droppings, saliva, and other bodily fluids, and then other animals coming in contact with those fluids and picking up the disease. And the disease can take a long time to manifest in an animal, so signs of chronic wasting disease, which include behavioral signs like the drooping of the head, not being able to walk properly, those might not show up until very late in the disease stages. So the way that the current Alberta government monitors for chronic wasting disease is the mandatory testing of deer heads in certain wildlife management units that you can see on the right-hand side of this map here. CWD is tested for in the brain and retropharyngeal lymph nodes of the animal. So there is mandatory testing of deer in these specific areas, as in Alberta, deer are the ones that most commonly carry the disease. But however, there is no real enforcement or punishment for not following the mandatory testing in these areas. As of this past fall hunting season in Alberta, 11.2% of tested heads tested positive in the 2019-2020 monitoring season, which is up from 7.4% of tested heads in the previous year.
The Bear Hills, otherwise known as Maskwacis, Alberta, located in central Alberta between the prairies and the mountains on fertile aspen parkland. The community consists of 4 bands: Louis Bull, Ermineskin, Montana, and Samson. Within this geographical location, deer, moose, small game, waterfowl are all hunted within and around the community by community members. As you can see, very fertile farmland, very good for wildlife grazing.
So before we dive into the specific community-based monitoring program that this project is developing, a bit of background on some of our guiding methods and theory. So one of the approaches to research that guided us in this project is community-based participatory research. This approach to research focuses on a shared decision-making power between research partners, bidirectional research capacity, and co-learning between research partners, and the co-creation of new knowledge that is mutually beneficial to both parties. And we also were influenced by access theory. So access theory refers to the political, economic, social, and cultural frames that surround how access to a resource is sought after can establish certain constraints on the ability to benefit from resources. So in this case, while there are legal rights for Indigenous hunters to be able to access healthy wildlife for subsistence hunting, actual access is influenced by many different frames. So some examples can be access to testing technology, so the potential for Indigenous hunters to actually be able to test the animals that they harvest for chronic wasting disease. The current Alberta government's monitoring program does have some difficulties in accessing testing for Indigenous hunters. This can include the amount of time that it takes for testing to be done. So during peak season, it can take months for a result to come back due to the backlog of submissions to the one lab in Edmonton that does the testing. Having to wait months for results on a harvested animal can create a big barrier to testing for Indigenous hunters who might need that meat quickly for either feeding their family, distributing to community, or requiring that animal for ceremonial purposes. Another barrier to access is that the drop-off freezers, where hunters can submit heads to a freezer left all around the affected area of the province. Those freezers are only available during fall rifle season, which is in November in Alberta. And Indigenous hunters are able to hunt and harvest these animals outside of fall rifle season. So when those drop-off freezers are not active and available, then hunters will have to drive all the way to Edmonton to one specific lab to drop off the head. So resources like time, money for gas, access to a vehicle are all things that are placed on the Indigenous hunters in getting those samples in outside of the fall rifle season. So instead of just focusing on the rights-based stream of property theory, access theory allows us to look at the wider relationship and power dynamics that affect who can benefit from certain resources, like chronic wasting disease-free wild meat.
How to: community-based monitoring of CWD, determining need, consultation with local leadership and community organizations, developing shared understanding and respectful relationship, working together to ensure that the proper protocol is followed for the gathering of the traditional knowledge from elders and hunters. And again, it's very valuable knowledge.
So to continue how we have been developing this community-based monitoring program for chronic wasting disease in Maskwacis, we focused on capacity building and collaboration. So from the beginning of this project, from planning which resources we were going to help create and how we were going to facilitate knowledge mobilization, as well as getting samples from the community into testing. We worked with existing community programs to build capacity to manage the spread of chronic wasting disease in Maskwacis. So this included us working with the Samson Community Freezer Program, as well as we worked to create space for Indigenous voices and concerns in local wildlife disease management. So in working with hunters, discussing what their difficulties were in either accessing information about chronic wasting disease or actually getting heads in for testing. We also work closely with hunters from Maskwacis, and knowledge from hunters, as well as the concerns that we mentioned earlier, assisted in the development of a toolkit that included survey tools for wildlife health observations. The toolkits have been distributed throughout the community, and the survey tool is included in the back of the toolkit. So if hunters were looking to track their own observations over time, they could use that toolkit either individually or as a group to keep track of those observations on a continual basis. Knowledge mobilization within the community was also an objective with our research partners and university team had set out at the beginning of the project. This has been done through things like a video project about chronic wasting disease that features voices from both Maskwacis as well as Treaty 8 First Nations. And this video will be soon available to spread on social media. And we also have organized community-led chronic wasting disease sample preparation workshops. So one that we did was, again, in collaboration with the Samson Community Freezer Program and some of the hunters that are involved with that program. And this involved having hunters lead a demonstration of how to properly prepare a sample of an animal head to be submitted for chronic wasting disease testing to the Government of Alberta laboratory. And these workshops also provide a great opportunity for people to come together and ask questions and really learn from each other about chronic wasting disease, the risks around it, and things that people would like to see in their community when it comes to managing this disease. And we've also worked at facilitating conversation between community members from Maskwacis and university researchers, especially creating conversation between some of the biologists and those behind the quote-unquote hard science of this disease, and creating some opportunities for co-learning. Community members are able to ask questions about the biology of the disease, and then researchers from the university are able to learn about some of the cultural aspects of wildlife health and the cultural importance of these species in the community.
Here was the first demonstration held in Samson, behind where the Samson Community Freezer is located. Here the demonstration included the proper removal of the deer head needed for submission. So it included where to make the incisions, on how to cut the skull from the body, and also to keep the glands intact needed for testing for CWD.
So a couple conclusions. Increasing instances of community-based monitoring programs in natural resource management, including wildlife health, require more tools and methods to be available, especially when currently there are few opportunities for Indigenous communities to engage in the monitoring of chronic wasting disease. So this pilot project aims to fill that gap specifically for the central Alberta Treaty 6 area. And concerns about wildlife health on a global scale with zoonotic diseases, food security, and food sovereignty point to a growing need for community engagement in the monitoring of wildlife and wildlife diseases. And that brings us to the end of our presentation. Thank you so much for your attention. We welcome any questions or comments.